everyone. So today's topic is social forestry to check desertification. So first, let's go through the objectives of the study. The first objective is understanding the definition of social forestry and its needs. The second is understanding closely the objectives and the mission behind social forestry. Thirdly, to get a close understanding of the various classifications of social forestry. And lastly, to get a close look at the benefits associated with social forestry and how it can check desertification. So before we move on with the study, there should be some terminologies one needs to know while addressing the topic. So the first term is afforestation. So what is afforestation? Afforestation mainly refers to an act or process of establishing a forest on a land which did not have a forest before, like which was not previously forested. The second is deforestation. Deforestation is the act of clearing a wide area of where actually existed a forest. The third term is desertification. So desertification is the process by which vegetation in dry lands, that is arid and semi-arid lands, which were grasslands or shrublands, they decrease and eventually they disappear. Now, the main terminology is global warming. So as we know, global warming has a generalized definition where the temperature of the earth is increasing day by day, but this has certain specific meanings. That is, when the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are increased in the Earth's atmosphere, they trap more and more sunlight. So these greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are usually used up by plants, and therefore the forest and the green cover is very important to keep these greenhouse gases at bay. But due to the decrease in the forest cover, or what we are calling as desertification, the amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere is increasing, which is trapping more and more heat and sunlight, and thus the whole process of global warming or increase in the temperature of the Earth is happening day by day. So first, we need to learn about the causes of desertification. The main causes of desertification are human activities like deforestation, the causes of which go beyond tree felling, which increases the risk of fires among others. Poor agricultural practices, from not practicing crop rotation to unprotected soils, use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, etc. Over-exploitation of natural resources. As a consequence, for example, of irresponsible management of vegetation or water. Even bad livestock practices such as overgrazing and severely erode the land and prevent the regeneration of vegetation. So now we will come to the consequences of desertification. Dry lands cover about half of the Earth's ice-free land surface, and many of them belong to the world's poorest countries, which exacerbates the consequences. So the first point is the loss of biodiversity by worsening the living conditions of many species. The second would be food insecurity due to crop failure and reduced yields. The loss of vegetation cover and therefore food for livestock and for human beings. Increased risk of zoonotic diseases, for example COVID-19. We all know how much trauma the whole world faced because of that pandemic. The loss of forest cover, which is with a corresponding shortage of even wood resources. The decrease in drinking water as we are losing all the aquifers. So, how does desertification have an effect on human health? So the potential impacts of desertification on health include higher threats of malnutrition from reduced food and water supplies, more water and foodborne diseases that result from poor hygiene and a lack of clean water, respiratory diseases caused by the atmospheric dust and the wind erosion and other air pollutants, the spread of infectious diseases as the populations migrate. So, how do we combat desertification? Promotion of coordinated land use planning, including management of water resources, livestock, and agricultural activities. Preservation of vegetation, which plays a key role in protecting the soil from getting eroded. Promotion of climate change and education and raising awareness. We can also focus on sustainable methods like organic farming and crop rotation, which can prevent soil erosion and even drought. We can also commit to reforestation and afforestation to generate vegetation cover and reactivate the moisture circulation and generate biodiversity. We can also encourage rotational grazing, which can limit the pressure to a particular area, while others regenerate through coexistence with crops and allow more nutrient cycling. So, as afforestation is one of the main methods by which we can combat desertification, social forestry comes into play. Now we will go through an introduction to social forestry. During the advent of the social forestry strategy, various terms were used to represent it. Not only social forestry, but also community forestry. So originally, these terms were used as synonyms. But both terms were used to refer to any forestry policies and activities that closely involved the local people in the forest management and tree growing, for which the rural people assumed the management responsibility and from which they derived a direct benefit. Gradually, however, the terms were differentiated on the basis of either normative commitments or management systems. In respect to normative commitments, it has been suggested that the term social forestry should primarily be understood as a reaction to the conventional approaches to forestry, which were dominated by the ideology of forest conservation and production forestry under state stewardship, which legitimized Forest Service control over forest lands and tree species. Let's define social forestry more clearly. Local communities use and manage forests throughout the world for subsistence, trade, and cultural purposes. In Southeast Asia, close to 140 million people generate livelihoods from forests. Forest management practices have evolved over time to meet the changing needs of local people, the market for forest products, and a range of political interests. Social forestry offers an alternative form of forest management. It is an approach that balances the needs of local people with multiple external interests. So, what does social forestry do? It engages communities living in and around the forests in sustainable forest use and management. Number 2, it empowers communities by raising awareness, building capacity, developing policies with local people, and recognizing their rights and systems of knowledge. Number 3, provides communities with benefits and access to forest resources in return for participating during the advent of social forestry strategy. Various terms were used to represent it, as we talked about it earlier. They were both called social forestry and community forestry, but in the due course of time, the two words attained two different meanings, and therefore social forestry is the only word which we are looking for. Community forestry, on the other hand, is a type of social forestry which we will read in detail in our later half of the lecture. So now that we have learned an introduction about social forestry, it's time for a small quiz. Which of the following defines social forestry? Your options are: option A, growing forest trees in conventional forest areas; option B, growing forest trees in non-conventional forest areas such as rural or urban areas; number C, both A and B, and option D, none of the above. And yes, I'm sure you're guessing it right. The correct answer is option B, growing forest trees in non-conventional forest areas such as rural and urban areas. So now we will come to the 3E criteria. So what does 3E mean? So the 3E stands for effective, efficient and equitable. The ensuring of 3E outcomes is key in determining the success of any policy or program. In the context of social forestry, the three components are effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. Effectiveness, that is outputs and benefits of social forestry. Efficiency, time and costs of social forestry. And equity is the ways benefits and costs are shared and distributed. So, the 3E criteria can be used in different stages of the policy making process for social forestry programs. So, the first can be design to assess available options and their expected outcomes. The assessment results can be used to inform planning and decision making processes to ensure that the appropriate approach is adopted for the particular program. The next is implementation, to guide and monitor how the programs conduct activities, progress, and adapt. The monitoring process keeps the program on track in achieving its objectives. Last is the evaluation. The evaluation to assess the actual outcomes of the programs or policies that were implemented. The evaluation process and its results are very important for adaptive policy and management learning. It allows feedback and provides an opportunity for further improvement in planning, managing, and implementing social forestry programs. So now we will discuss in detail the assessment of the 3E criteria. A detailed set of checklist questions complements each of the contexts to help users assess the 3E criteria in planned initiatives and activities. So, social forestry is the management and protection of forests and afforestation of barren, deforested lands, with the purpose of helping environmental, social, and rural development. The term social forestry was first used in 1976 by the National Commission on Agriculture, when the Government of India aimed to reduce pressure on the forest by planting trees on all unused and fallow lands. It was intended as a democratic approach to forest conservation and usage, maximizing land utilization for multiple purposes. The Indian government attempted to expand forest areas which were close to human settlements and which had degraded due to human activities. Trees were planted along railway lines, roadsides, rivers, and canal banks. In village common land, government wasteland, and panchayat land, and were to be planted in and around agricultural fields. Among the goals were to increase fuel availability in rural areas and to prevent soil erosion, which is a huge topic of concern. This program was a failure due to lack of governance and management and was delegated to the village panchayats or the village councils. So, participation in soil forestry programs. The soil forestry scheme sought to enable the most common people to raise plantations which would meet the growing demand for timber, fuel wood, fodder, etc., and thereby reduce pressure on the traditional forest areas. This concept of village forests to meet the needs of rural people had existed for centuries across India. With the introduction of this scheme, the government formally recognized the rights of local communities to the forest resources and encouraged rural participation and management of natural resources. Through social forestry scheme, the government has involved community participation as a part of a drive towards afforestation and rehabilitating the degraded forest and common lands. Bihar, one of the poorest states of India, lacked the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is NREGA, employment during the flood season, and this work was only suitable for able-bodied people. Linking the social forestry scheme to NREGA was hoped to reduce poverty and climate change. To ensure adequate care for the plants, their ownership was given to those who cared for them for 5 years. Within 3 years, the forest coverage in the region grew from 7% to 12.86% and provided employment to thousands of women, disabled, and even elderly people. After managing the project for 5 years, the government delegated authority to the village panchayats or the village councils to manage for themselves and generate products or revenue as they saw fit. After learning so much about how social forestry has been implemented, we will learn about the main objectives of this scheme. So the first objective is improve the environment for protecting agriculture from adverse climatic factors, increase the supply of fuel wood for domestic use, small timber for rural housing, fodder for livestock, and minor forest produce for local industries. Increase the natural beauty of landscape, create recreational forests for the benefit of rural and even urban populations, provide jobs for unskilled workers, effect land rehabilitation, and raise the standard of living and quality of life of the rural and the urban people. So, what is the mission of the scheme? To carry out a need-based and time-bound program of afforestation with special emphasis on fuel wood and fodder development on the degraded and denuded lands or forests. The second is the effect afforestation of abundant jhum lands and mined areas. Establish linear strip plantation for fast-growing species on the sides of public roads, rivers and streams, and even irrigation canals. Create green belts in urban and industrial areas. Create shelter belts, generally more extensive than the windbreaks, for the purpose of shelter from wind and sun-covering areas larger than a single farm in a planned pattern. Establish farm forestry in the form of raising rows of trees on the boundaries of the fields and individual trees in private agricultural land, as well as creation of windbreaks around a farm or an orchard by raising 1 or 2 lines of trees. Raise flowering trees and shrubs to serve as recreation forests for urban and rural population. Elicit people's participation involving women and young people in the conservation of forests, wildlife, and the environment. Generate environmental awareness and promote environmental event. As we learned all the missions that are related to social forestry, it's time to learn about the different types of social forestry. So, social forestry schemes can be categorized into groups like farm forestry, community forestry, extension forestry, and agroforestry. Even scientific forestry or silviculture. Scientific forestry focuses on replacing and replanting of new crops and trees. Also known as silviculture, the various objectives of scientific forestry are afforestation in blank areas, trying to increase raw materials for forest-based industries, production of high-quality timber species, raise species which will give more economic value, and ensure soil conservation. So, what is farm forestry? In farm forestry or agroforestry, trees are grown on farmland for commercial and non-commercial purposes. farmers are encouraged to plant trees on their own farmlands to meet their domestic needs. A tradition of growing trees on farmland already existed in many areas and was the main thrust of most of India's social forestry projects. In addition to providing fuel wood, farmers often grow trees to provide shade for agricultural crops, as wind shelters, for soil conservation, or to recover wasteland. The pulp and paper industry is a major demand driver for certain species of trees such as eucalyptus, babul, acacia, catechu, subabul, and casuarina. As a rough estimate, the total demand for pulpwood is approximately 10 million air-dried metric ton. The Indian Paper Manufacturers Association is an umbrella organization that coordinates and drives plantation efforts by member organizations in India to supply its industrial requirements. So as we know that the pulp industry needs a lot of pulp wood for the production of so much paper that is used throughout India, and therefore the Indian Paper Manufacturers Association comes into play. Now, as we discussed earlier, we will talk about community forestry. Once which was considered synonymous to social forestry, but now is a type of social forestry. So in community forestry, the government provides seedlings and fertilizer to the community, which is then responsible for nurturing and protecting the plants on the community land. This provides for the community rather than individuals. Fast-growing eucalyptus has been planted on a large scale. Some communities manage these plantations sensibly and in a sustainable manner for continual benefit, while others sell the mature timber for a one-time capital investment. Community forestry, planting trees on public or community land such as schoolyards, roadsides, canal banks, village pastures, and temple grounds is also known as community forestry. The goal of community forestry programs is to benefit the entire community, and thus the name. Community forestry provides a means under which people of landless classes can associate themselves with tree raising and thus get those benefits that otherwise are restricted for landowners. According to a study that was published in the journal Nature Sustainability, community forest management led to a 37% relative decrease in deforestation and a 4.3% relative decrease in poverty, which is an amazing result. Farm forestry is a term used to describe the practice of farmers growing trees on their fields for both commercial and non-commercial purposes, as we discussed earlier. Next type of social forestry is urban forestry. So urban forestry pertains to the raising and management of trees on public and privately owned lands. In and around urban centers such as green belts, parks, roadside avenues, industrial and commercial green belts, etc. The ministry is implementing the Nagar Van Yojana, the scheme initiated for creation of Nagar Van or a city forest in urban areas under the National Fund of Compensatory Afforestation, Fund Management and Planning Authority, CAMPA. Development of urban forests will contribute to India's decision to sequester 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in the country's forests. They will also function as urban lungs. The rural forestry lays emphasis on the promotion of agroforestry and community forestry. Like urban forestry, rural forestry is a smaller division of social forestry, and similar things are done in and laying emphasis on agroforestry and community forestry. The last type of social forestry is extension forestry. So planting of trees on the sides of roads, canals, railways, along with planting on wastelands is also known as extension forestry, that is increasing the boundaries of the forest. This has created wood, lots in the village common lands, government wastelands, and even panchayat lands. So now we have learned about all the different types of social forestry and their different names and how they are classified under the umbrella name of social forestry. So it's time for another quiz. So which is a component of extension forestry? Your options are A, farm forestry, B, community woodlots, C, shelter belts, and D, all of the above. The correct answer is C, shelter belts. So now that we have learned all about social forestry, in this section we will learn about the benefits of social forestry. So first we will go through the main important benefits, and then we will also learn the benefits in details. So first, social forestry, the 6 important benefits. So the first is fight against global warming. Trees have a vital role in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, as we discussed earlier. And areas having tree cover will be much cooler than the areas without it, thus helping it reducing the energy use. Trees reduce carbon dioxide and thus act as a carbon dioxide sink, which is the main reason how it can decrease global warming. The next is soil conservation. Social forestry helps in soil conservation through the following ways. Tree roots help in preventing soil erosion by holding the soil in its place. Trees reduce soil erosion by reducing the impact of raindrops on barren land surface. Decaying leaves make the soil richer by forming an organic layer on the top and reducing the soil erosion. It also helps in increasing the capacity of the soil in storing water. Increase in the biodiversity. Well-grown trees offer habitation for various animals, plants, shrubs, birds, insects, etc. The trees become a source of food and even shelter. Health benefits by improvement of the air quality. Afforestation and social forestry helps people by removing various pollutants present in the atmosphere and gives clean and fresh air to breathe in. Clean air is vital for health of human beings. Moreover, many types of trees also have medicinal values. Conservation of energy. The cooling effect provided by the trees on the area where it is planted helps in reduction of the consumption of air conditioners, which directly reduce energy consumption throughout. Lesser energy conservation means lesser demand for power, which directly leads to lesser power generation through power plants that consume fossil fuels. And lastly, the social benefits. Social forestry helps in the creation of recreation parks, which will help people de-stress due to the busy schedules that they live in. We will go through the benefits of social forestry in details. So as we talked in the important benefits, obviously an increase in the biodiversity, which is growing trees in barren lands, which help the community to increase the forest coverage, hence helping in increasing biodiversity. Carbon removal. Trees act as carbon sinks in the fight against global warming effect. It plays an essential role in the removal of carbon from the environment, and carbon dioxide being the main greenhouse gas and the villain behind global warming. So it is seen as the best way to reduce carbon dioxide in the urban settings. Curbing global warming, as we talked about, that the areas with tree cover will be substantially cooler, and it helps in lowering energy consumption. Soil conservation, once again, the trees hold the soil in place and helps mitigate soil erosion. Health benefits. Trees and nature are natural remedies for stress, anxiety, and other health benefits. Noise pollution. Embracing social forestry in urban areas can mitigate the effects of noise pollution. Trees reflect and absorb sound energy, reducing this noise. As we talked about, again, the improvement of the air quality, and by cleaning the air which is full of dust and other substances that cause harm to our healths. Government measures, the respective state government implements a number of legislation, including the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, the Indian Forest Act of 1927, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, and other central and state laws as applicable to a state for the preservation and protection of forest and wildlife. National Forest Policy of 1988 give provisions under the National Forest Policy to encourage a need-based and time-bound program of afforestation and tree planting through afforestation, social forestry and farm forestry, with the involvement of local communities. The policy encourages the planting of trees alongside roads, railways, rivers and streams, as we talked about earlier, because all these are processes of social forestry. And institutional or private ownership, including creation of green belts in private ownership, including the creation of green belts in even urban and industrial areas, as well as in the arid tracts. Social forestry schemes from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change encourages plantation in the country, including various metropolitan cities, through programs and schemes such as the Nagar Van School Nursery Yojana, Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority, which is the CAMPA, National Afforestation Program, which is NAP, National Mission for Green India, which is GIM. The purpose of these schemes is to promote urban forestry, tree plantation on vacant lands and bunds on farmlands, etc., by involving local communities, NGOs, educational institutions, and other local bodies. Importance of social forestry as it offers an alternative form of forest management. It is an approach that balances the needs of local people with multiple external interests. Promotes sustainable forest use and management among communities who live near and in close proximity to the forest, empowers communities by increasing awareness, building capacity, working with locals to establish policies, and respecting their rights and knowledge systems. Gives communities access to the forest resources and benefits in exchange for the participation in sustainable forest management, classification of social forestry, and the objectives of social forestry adopted by NCA were to fulfill the basic and economic needs of the community. So now it's time for another quiz. Who coined the word social forestry? Option A, Gifford Pinchot. Option B, Sir Dietrich Brandis. Option C, J.C. Westboy. And option D, Walter Hood Fitch. So, the correct answer is option A, Gifford Pinchot, who is not only the person behind social forestry, but he is also known as the father of social forestry. So now we will learn about the implication for institutional and human resources. By definition, the primary focus in forestry is on people and community involvement on the trees that yield the direct and indirect benefits sought. The complexity of the physical, social, and economic dimensions of the rural systems within which the social forestry must be integrated accounts for the wide span of disciplines as well as administrative and other functional entities which this field of development entails. A high degree of coordination among all entities concerned is necessary at the working level to ensure effective data gathering, analysis and synthesis, that is research, policy formulation, project design, planning and implementation. A key feature of social forestry is recognition of the need to involve representatives of target groups, including women and landless, in data assembly and analysis, as well as in design. The planning and implementation phases of project development are necessarily concerned with forging strong linkages at all levels concerned between the various disciplines and institutional entities. The development of institutional arrangements for delivery of extension services with associated arrangements for monitoring and evaluation of project implementation and progress, which was urged in FAO 1987, as well as the necessary appropriate trained personnel, has been an important feature of all the social forestry programs. The tendency in India has been developed joint agricultural forestry extension and monitoring the evaluation units. Experience has indicated the value of these activities conducted on a participatory basis in relation to the development and refinement of social forestry technologies and to assisting farmers to develop their own problem-solving skills. The research needs for design, planning, and implementation of social forestry programs can be and are met at least in part by existing in-country forestry and agricultural and economic research organizations and university faculties. These resources are frequently limited and require strengthening to provide a new analytical design and managerial skills needed is apparent. Meantime, valuable support is being rendered often on an ad hoc basis by aid organizations such as the NGOs and SFFG 201. A good example of support of this kind by aid agencies is the current joint high priority FAO and SIDA initiative to develop implementable participatory methods of problem identification and project design. Thus, we come to the conclusion of this lecture. Social forestry is practiced through the medium of any of one of the 5 tree management models, which can include agroforestry applications. The extent of acceptance of social forestry as an approach to the meeting needs of the rural people and the research and development support is already receiving indicate that they are here to stay and will grow in importance as a major effective approach towards rural development. So in this lecture, we learned about the definition of social forestry. We also learned a lot about the objectives and the missions behind social forestry. We learned about the benefits associated with social forestry and how much it can have an impact on checking the desertification that is happening all around us nowadays. And lastly, we also learned about the implication of institutional and human resources for social forestry. Thank you.